moment had arrived as a nation where we face deep racial inequities in America and systemic racism that has plagued our nation for far, far too long. And so now's the time to act.
The White House says it is committed to working with Congress to pass bold legislation that advances racial equity. But activists say they want to see more action than words from the Biden administration. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. President Joe Biden has directed his administration to tackle racism, inequality, and discrimination in what the White House is calling the Racial Equity Agenda. Biden signed 4 executive orders seeking to redress racially discriminatory federal housing policies that have fueled wealth inequality, end the Department of Justice's use of private prisons, respect the sovereignty of Native American tribes, and combat violence and xenophobia against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. The director of Biden's Domestic Policy Council, Susan Rice, who will be responsible for overseeing the implementation of these executive orders, emphasized the importance of racial equity policies for the overall economic progress of the United States.
Economists have estimated that the U.S. economy has lost a staggering $16 trillion over the last 20 years because of discrimination against families of color. If we closed racial gaps in income and opportunity, these same economists have estimated we could add $5 trillion to the U.S. economy over the next 5 years.
So can the Biden administration close these racial gaps? Joining me now to discuss is Democratic Congressman from Illinois, Danny Davis. Congressman Davis, you've said in the last few months that the last year has demonstrated with unblinking clarity the impact of systemic racism on every aspect of American society. You've spoken about the stranglehold of racism on African Americans. Does President Biden's racial equity agenda address some of your concerns? How far will it go in healing America's racial divide?
You know, President Biden is absolutely a breath of fresh air in terms of, first, the willingness to even talk about in an open way and discuss the fact that we have a long way to go to try and bring America out of the doldrums of where it has been. And so I am seriously optimistic when I look at what President Biden has done already in just a few days of reversing some of the actions of President Trump, which gives me a signal that he's well on his way to helping us move. Not that he's a panacea, not that it's going to happen overnight, but it's well on the way. And I think the country's in great hands with Joe Biden.
Is it going to be enough, though? The Biden administration says every government agency, every department will infuse equity and racial justice and will report back within 200 days on the systemic barriers that exist. But these barriers have existed for a long time. They're plain for everyone to see. Does the government have to go further? Should the government commit to doing more for the African American community? Should it commit to reparations for African American enslavement? Or would that be going too far?
Without a doubt, I've been told that you can determine to a great extent what one is likely to do by what they've already done. And so if you look at how President Biden has started, he said that he was going to have the most diverse cabinet. And I tell you, I think he is well on the way to creating that kind of environment, that kind of government. And we're going to get him to the point. I mean, reparations for African Americans is a big part now of dialogue. A lot of the conversation, people are saying it and not saying it as something far away, out of reach, but saying it with a sense of reality and a belief that it has to come.
The White House, though, so far hasn't made a mention of this issue, but it has said that the president wants to allocate resources to address the historic failure to invest sufficiently, justly, and fairly in underserved communities. Biden also said that he will ban new private prison contracts, but there are currently only 11 private prisons under contract. And according to the Bureau of Prisons, there are only 14,000 inmates in private prisons, which is just 9% of the federal prison population. The president's executive order does nothing to address the bigger problem, which is mass incarceration, with African Americans making up about 40% of the incarcerated population, despite being only 13% of the population. Isn't that the real problem?
That's a real problem, and we're going to push him to do that. One of the things that I noted is that during the campaign, the literature that I passed out had a photograph of Joe Biden and myself standing in the Oval Office with President Bush when he signed my Second Chance Act, which means that Joe Biden was there then. I think he's going to be seriously engaged in ways to reduce the impact of mass incarceration. We've already got judicial action taking place, but we're going to put money into reentry and help those individuals who are in need of being restored to normal life.
Let me ask you finally, you were involved in the civil rights movement in Chicago back in the 1960s. When you look at where the United States stands today on racial and social justice, does it look like it is on the right path, or is it in some ways sliding backwards?
It has been sliding, and there have been efforts, especially during the last 4, 5, and even more years. But I think that we can retract, we can get back to going. Those were some of the most exciting years of my life, to see the kind of action, the movement, we called it. And we have to create, and we are creating, additional movements, new movements. Black Lives Matter, people in the streets, people holding each other accountable. And I think it's going to be a good period, as I said earlier.
Congressman Danny Davis, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you.
I ran for president because I believe we're in a battle for the soul of this nation. And the simple truth is, our soul will be troubled as long as systemic racism is allowed to persist.
After years of growing racial tensions and inequalities and an overt resurgence of white supremacy under Trump, President Biden vowed to target systemic racism early on in his administration. African Americans whose votes effectively elected the Biden-Harris ticket hope their administration will be an inflection point in the fight against racism, spearheaded by the Black Lives Matter movement, just nominated for the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize. I'm now joined by the activist Kimberly Jones, author of I'm Not Dying With You Tonight. Her video, How Can We Win?, posted during the Black Lives Matter protest following George Floyd's brutal killing last summer, went viral. Here's some of it.
So when they say, why do you burn down the community? Why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. There's a social contract that we all have, that if you steal or if I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. So the social contract is broken.
Kimberly Jones, in that powerful video, you also spoke about the financial gap between white and Black Americans, about the food insecurity, the centuries-old injustices. You also said it was like playing a game of Monopoly that was fixed from the very start. In a poignant moment, you said this. You said, for 400 years, we played your game and built your wealth. You are lucky that what Black people are looking for is equality and not revenge. If the game is fixed and the social contract is broken, What will it take to achieve equality?
I think that the people of the civil rights movement did a magnificent job of focusing on civil rights issues that pushed the envelope on equality. I think if I had a time machine and I could go back to that video, that would be the one piece that I would change, is to say that they're lucky that what Black people are looking for is equity and not revenge. And because I think that is where we have to fight now on the front, is equity in healthcare, equity in home ownership, equity in small business loan lending. This is the direction that we have to do now, so that African Americans, particularly ones who are extremely marginalized, have a fair shot at having a full lived life in America. When you look at the amount of small business loans, with redlining in terms of small business loans and home buying in Black communities, that is a practice system. When you look at the fact that we live in we basically, when it comes to our educational system, it's an educational caste system where schools are funded based on property taxes. So the poor get a poor education and the wealthy get a good education. When you're looking at all of these equity issues that hold us back, when you're talking about people who are sitting in prison for upward of 2 years because they don't have a minimal bond to get out on small and petty crimes, this is an equity issue that we're facing now that we have to combat and work
And
against.
Biden is now saying that he wants to make racial justice and equity one of the centerpieces of his presidency. Do you trust him to follow through on this? Because there have been promises made by previous presidents. But is this moment in American history different?
I believe that this moment in American history is different because the civil unrest of 2020 was a global response to the inequities that African Americans have faced in this country. And so I think there is a certain level of pressure that is on this new administration, is to not only to do right by African Americans, but actually, honestly, to fix some of their wrongs. Joe Biden participated in the 1994 crime bill that separated families, that gave extremely overly harsh sentences. You have people sitting in prison for 20, 30, 40 years for minimal marijuana charges. And now we're looking at allowing major corporations to potentially earn billions of dollars in that market where people have been separated from their families and their homes for minimal amounts, a user's amount of marijuana. And so I think there is a responsibility on his part to correct some of the wrongs that he participated in. I've heard him speak about it and saying that at the time he thought he was doing the right thing, but he recognizes now that he wasn't. And that apology is great, but what that apology has to be backed by is action. So that I'm hopeful that he will take that
But what
step.
kind of action? Because now that you do have a sympathetic president in the White House who owes his election victory largely to African American voters, what are you and other racial justice activists pushing for to leverage the power and the influence that you've gained?
I think the first thing that we're looking at is prison and police reform. Those are going to be the first things, because the omnipresent threat to the Black form by rogue police officers is just something that we have to address out the gate. I think getting rid of qualified immunity so that these cases can be tried properly is one of the first things that we need to see happen. And I'm a big fan of looking at this as Reconstruction 2.0. Reconstruction was dismantled way too early, and the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a bureau that was put in place to allow African Americans to transition smoothly into society after formerly enslaved people were released, never really saw its full fruition. And so now we have disparities in so many different categories, from healthcare to home ownership, that we have to look at such a big picture of what has to be done to dismantle the systemic racism that has affected Black people in such a horrific and specific way, that I think we have to look at something like a reinstatement of a bureau similar to the Freedmen's Bureau, look at Reconstruction 2.0 so that we could tackle these issues on every front.
And you mentioned that one of the important aspects of racial equity is the issue of policing and its impact on the African American community. A study that came out last summer showed that Black Americans were 3 times more likely to be shot and killed by police officers during interactions where the victim posed little or no threat to the officers. What will it take to change this pervasive culture, to change this fatal knee-jerk reaction that sadly happens way too often?
I think that this is part of what the defund the police movement is talking about. I think there's been a lot of propaganda to make it feel as if though we are trying to have a negative effect on public safety of Americans as an entire whole. And that's not what it is. The defund the police movement is saying we need to reallocate funds so that we are more productively utilizing the police department. It takes you longer to get a barber's license and a cosmetology license than it does to become a police officer. The training is not extensive enough. We are not doing the proper mental health checks. We are over-policing marginalized neighborhoods in order to make budgets in cities. All of that has to be dismantled if we're going to deal with the issue at hand.
Kimberly Jones, a real pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for being part of the program.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Now, one of the key areas of discrimination against African Americans is housing. In her Senate confirmation hearings last week, President Biden's nominee for Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Marcia Fudge, pledged to meet the challenges facing minorities, especially the African American community.
There are so many issues we need to come together to address. Everything from bringing capital back to disinvested communities, to increasing energy efficiency in housing, to dealing with the dangers of lead-based paint, to taking on our crisis of homelessness with compassion and resolve. These are only some of the challenges, and I know that many of you have additional priorities as well. These problems are urgent, but they are not beyond our capacity to solve.
So what will it take for the Biden administration to reverse the decades-old discriminatory housing policies that kept communities of color behind? I'm joined by former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Bill Clinton, Henry Cisneros. He's also the former mayor of the city of San Antonio in Texas. Secretary Cisneros, you led the Department of Housing and Urban Development back in the 90s and were in fact credited with implementing policies that contributed to achieving the country's highest ever rate of home ownership. But during that period, and certainly today, discriminatory housing policies have persisted. How much of a difficult task will the next Secretary of Housing and Urban Development face in fighting the system, in dismantling these old racist policies, given the resistance of some lawmakers today to the concept of racial equity?
I just spoke, interestingly enough, to the incoming Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Congresswoman Marcia Fudge. She was also the mayor of a small community outside of Cleveland. And I described to her that I think she's going to have one of the more difficult beginnings of any HUD secretary. None of us in recent decades have had to deal with something as serious as the pandemic and what it will mean in terms of evictions, what it will mean in terms of people who are homeless, what it will mean in terms of a slowing economy and people who will be losing jobs and their housing will be threatened, and the sickness itself, safety conditions and so forth associated with the coronavirus. So it is a big and difficult job. Now, as to the issue that you raise, it's a very serious problem because the housing markets don't work if there is overt discrimination. I worked very closely with a group called the Urban Institute back then, and they had perfected systems of testing to determine whether discrimination exists in a market. They would send, for example, an African American with good employment profile and perfectly presentable out to answer a request for an apartment that had appeared in the newspaper. And when they got there, the landlord would say, "Oh my goodness, you just missed it. We rented that apartment 2 hours ago. I'm sorry, but it's just not available." So the person would leave. Then the second tester would go about 3 hours later, and that person would be the same in every profile, economic and education, but be white. And the landlord would say, "Sure, give me a second. I've got to get the key and I'll show you the apartment." And they were caught, red-handed in overt discrimination.
But doesn't it,
and unfortunately,
Secretary Cisneros, doesn't it speak though to these policies that have been put in place for far too long? The fact that in 2020, you still have only 44% of Black families who own homes compared to 74% of white families. And the data shows that the home ownership gap has in fact widened since 1976. Doesn't it speak to the kind of policies that need to be addressed, like redlining, a policy that led to the federal government and banks denying mortgages to people in minority neighborhoods? What should the government
Yes,
do
it
about
does
this?
speak. Yes, it does speak to those policies. And over the years, we've done a great deal to try to address those policies. On my watch, we were able to get the black home ownership, the African American home ownership rate up from 42% to just below 50%. And the Latino home ownership rate went from 42% to 50%. So we made good progress. Unfortunately, in the last administration, they worked very hard to undo a lot of the protections that would help people address discrimination. One of the first things President Biden has done is reinstate the most advanced and far-reaching fairness agenda, what's called fair housing regulations, and he's put some of those back in place. But fundamentally, you're right. We have a long way to go because discrimination in the housing markets continues to be real.
And so how do you level the playing field? Because the incoming Health Secretary says that this will be one of her areas of focus. She says that cash is the biggest impediment to home ownership. Should the government, in your opinion, offer down payment assistance to residents of previously redlined neighborhoods to achieve the fair housing that you speak about?
It may be that down payment assistance is an option, but I would say a number of things. First, we need to produce more affordable housing, both home ownership and rental. So production is one part of the equation. We need to have in place fair housing rules and regulations to make sure that people are not being discriminated against. We need to work with the banks to make financing more available to people who want to get into housing, home ownership. We need to have robust local involvement, cities and states, counties, local governments, making sure that there's not discrimination in the housing markets. We need to produce smaller scale housing and change zoning regulations so smaller scale housing can be allowed, including sometimes multiple units on the same lot. So there are many, many things that can be done at many levels to try to create a more level playing field.
And of course, it isn't just Black Americans, but Latinos too, who face discrimination, who face the threat of eviction from their homes, especially now with the pandemic. They are, in fact, more likely than white Americans to have lost their jobs, and they are struggling to pay rent. And we know too well the conditions in which Native Americans also live. I know you were on the board, on the advisory board of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, looking at ways to mitigate the economic impact of the coronavirus on underserved communities. And you've spoken before about creating some kind of social infrastructure. When you consider that just 5% of the vaccine doses given nationwide so far have gone to Black people, only 11% have gone to Latinos, and this is according to the data that's been put out by the CDC, and I believe it's about 2% for Native Americans. Does it tell us what we need to know about the depth of the racial inequalities this country still faces?
Well, there's no question but that the coronavirus uncovered some very serious inequities that continue in our country. Workers who were called essential workers had to go to work. They provided the basic services of transportation and medical care and food service and food production that needed to continue, and therefore they had to go to work. That made them more exposed. They had lower incomes. They had to be working. And so you see the impact of the coronavirus on food worker plants, for example, and medical personnel. And so it's been very disproportionate in its impact. So there is a short-term emergency relief set of measures that need to be done. And then there's building the infrastructure of the future. In the course of most people, when they talk about infrastructure, they mean water, power, roads, airports, seaports. As a result of this pandemic, we will have to recognize there is a need for social infrastructure, which means things like clinics, schools, housing, and other modernization of the basic infrastructure of life.
Secretary Cisneros, great to talk to you. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
And so in a country conquered from Native American tribes and whose wealth accumulation was largely the product of slavery, Racial discrimination is more than systemic and will require far more than the signing of executive orders, as laudable as these first decisions by President Biden may be. Removing the scourge of racism from society, from the economic system, will require much more. In the end, the 1964 Civil Rights Act was a big leap forward, but almost 6 decades on, it has shown its limitations. And whether it is housing, healthcare, education, the judiciary, or prison system, the reach of the federal government is limited in a staunchly federal system. Any impulse the Biden administration can give to improve the lot of ethnic minorities will likely be modest, but it will be a critical step to appease racial tensions and mobilize American society at large to thwart the open resurgence of white nationalism, which proudly came out of the shadows during Trump's tenure. And so, in short, whether the genie of white supremacism of QAnon cult members can be put back in the bottle during the Biden administration is an open question. What is evident, as President Biden himself has stated, is that it is, quote, a battle for the soul of the United States. It is likely to be a bitter and long fight, even violent at times judging by recent events, because even if they do represent a small minority of Americans, white supremacists and right-wing groups agree with Biden on one score. It is indeed a fight for the soul of their nation. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry. Let me know what you think. From the entire team in Washington, thanks for watching.